people are acknowledging that you can't just follow the physical health and safety bouncing ball in the context of psychosocial risk. And I think that's a positive thing. The concept of psychosocial risk is far from new, but the dialogue and industry discussion about the topic has elevated since regulatory changes were announced in 2023 and 2024. Psychosocial risk is now the focus of many conversations in the corporate world, from boardrooms to executive teams, and of course through to the practitioners on the ground trying to join the dots to have meaningful impact. I'm Kate Connors. I'm a Master's Qualified Psychologist, and my professional purpose is to help people and workplaces be at their best.
And I'm Greg Smith. I'm a lawyer who's spent more than 30 years practicing in the areas of employment law and workplace health and safety. I'm also the author of several books, including Paper Safe and the recently published Proving Safety.
And you are listening to Judgmental, when a psychologist and a lawyer walk into a barside chat about psychosocial risk. A big thanks to our sponsor, EML. EML are Australia's largest personal injury claims provider, providing claims management services to workers' compensation, life insurance and CTP markets with the purpose of helping people get their lives back. We have another jam-packed episode today, so grab a drink and sit back for another discussion at the bar. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Series 2, Episode 1. And it's Kate Connors here. Thank you very much for joining us in our virtual bar. I would love to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I am on as I'm recording this afternoon, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome in Greg Smith. Welcome to 2025, Mr. Smith.
Hey Kate, how are you going today? You good?
I'm pretty good. I'm a little bit of a rushed afternoon, so I'm just getting my head into our... It's exciting. We're on Series 2.
We are. And I'm, just to follow up, I'm on the lands of the Badjara people of the Noongar Nation down in the southwest of WA, working from my home office today. And I just like to acknowledge that I'm on their land and also pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So, Season 2.
Season 2, we did our special episode about the Vision Australia case, which was just a little tidy up from Series 1. But here we are on Series 2. Who'd have thought that we'd get endorsed for a second series? But that's good, isn't it? We're learning.
It is good.
In this podcast caper.
We're learning all about podcasts. What did you learn from the first series about podcasting, Kate?
Well, as I mentioned on one of my LinkedIn posts, I learned that as the good psychologist that I like to think that I am, I use a lot of nonverbal cues to show that I'm listening to people, and that's not helpful in podcasts. You've got to just be quiet and let the other person talk. Thanks, Dad, for that point of feedback.
I thought that was hilarious. Prime feedback came from your dad.
We do have other feedback points, which we will get to, but essentially, listeners, today what we are going to be doing is priming everybody ready for Series 2, do a little bit of sharing in regards to some reflections that Greg and I both have about Series 1. Mindful that Series 1 was recorded way before it was released, which is going to be different to how we plan to do Series 2. But really, Greg, we just wanted to also kind of connect in with everybody on it's busy out there in psychosocial risk land. There's lots of activity going on for people to try and keep on top of, isn't there? How are you finding that?
It's interesting. Yeah, I feel the busyness. I feel lots of questions and concerns. There certainly seems to be more case law coming through at a pretty rapid clip, most of it coming out of the Fair Work Commission at the moment, although there are a few other interesting cases that we're really going to deep dive into in this next series, particularly looking around the question of bullying and harassment.
Yeah.
And we have a fairly significant set of proceedings coming up in Western Australia. The WorkSafe over here has prosecuted the Department of Justice for alleged significant bullying and harassment in the Bunbury Regional Prison. The particulars and the details aren't known, but from the media reports, it's bullying and harassment between staff, so it's got nothing to do with the inmates or anything like that. So that's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. And unfortunately, if there's a not guilty plea, we probably won't see very much until, in terms of a trial date, at least until 2026,
Right.
I suspect. And if there's a guilty plea, it'll just be a mitigation and we won't actually learn much anyway. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how the court deals with it, because it's one of the few cases where we're actually starting to see the prosecutions for bullying and harassment as opposed to physical assault, which is what a lot of the psychosocial prosecutions have been, physical assaults or suicides or those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, when we were prepping for this conversation, I did a quick scan over the things that had been released out into the market. There's activity in Queensland in regards to prevention plans being required from 1st of
Yes.
March. The VIC regulations have been announced as coming out in October, operational 1 December. There's been reports about connection with psychosocial risk into musculoskeletal injury. There's been, this is one we definitely want to talk about, there's been the way that the tick and flick comment that was it a commissioner or a judge made in the Fair Work? Would have been a commissioner, wouldn't it? And
It
that's
was Fair
been
Work
kind of,
Commission decision.
yeah, that being kind of reported as though an employer was prosecuted for tick and flick risk assessment when that actually was not remotely what the tick and flick comment was connected to. So I think, all of that really is justification. Is it justification or it's validation, I think is a better word, for why we wanted to have these conversations, because there's just so much activity, hard for people to sift through what's real, what's not, and feel as though they're, for their own psychological wellbeing management, feel as though they're staying on top of information they need to be aware of and building their psychological literacy and safety literacy without dipping into overwhelm in terms of so many things to read.
So as we were talking about before we came on air in that tick and flick case, that's kind of part of a broader series of cases that are being hyped up as psychosocial cases where they really, at its core, have nothing to do with psychosocial risk. So you remember in Series 1 we did the Blue Scope case where a worker was accused of poor conduct, their employment was terminated, they brought an unfair dismissal claim, the company didn't make the complainant to give evidence in the unfair dismissal case, and the worker who was terminated had their unfair dismissal case upheld and were reinstated. Now, the case was about psychosocial risk to the extent that it arose from a misconduct or alleged misconduct and abusive conduct, but it was really just a procedural fairness legal process matter. It didn't tell us anything about psychosocial risk or the management of psychosocial risk. It told us that if you were going to sack somebody, you need to have evidence and you're going to have to produce that evidence in an unfair dismissal case. Off the back of that, there was another case called the Bull and Mushrooms case where, again, very similar, lots of allegations that the court ended up saying that they were scanty, illogical, secondhand, no real evidence. People didn't get called as witnesses. And again, the same thing happened, unfair dismissal overturned. Again, doesn't tell us anything about psychosocial risk, tells us about process. And the tick and flick case was the same. The allegation there was, and it was kind of salacious because the worker was accused of, and I think fundamentally admitted to, a bunch of pretty ordinary conduct, to be honest.
It was salacious if you read what
was.
was said to a fellow employee. Yes.
But the termination was overturned because of the commissioner made a finding that the policy and procedures in relation to code of conduct and expected behaviours weren't properly rolled out. They were presented at a toolbox talk. There were like 24 people, I think, who in attendance. The toolbox talk went for 30 minutes. And the commission said that's not giving sufficient attention or detail to such an important topic. People may not have understood what it's all about. And she described I think it was a she, I could be wrong, apologies, but the commissioner described the process of presenting the information about the policies and procedures as a tick and flick exercise designed to achieve compliance. And again, it tells us nothing about psychosocial risk. It tells us nothing about the content of the documents. It tells us nothing about it tells us nothing that we didn't already know in every other sphere of employment. If you roll out policies and procedures in a tick and flick compliance-based way without ensuring understanding, they're not going to hold up. If you don't bring witnesses to unfair dismissal cases, you're probably going to lose. If you don't have a solid basis for making findings of fact against workers who have been alleged of misconduct, if you don't have proper evidence, you're going to lose. Whether it's psychosocial risk, performance management, fraud, misconduct, it doesn't matter. So all this stuff is being escalated as some new wave of psychosocial risk classes of cases, and they are not. So we need to really, I think, the professional community out there has an obligation to its constituents to just calm the farm down a bit. And if we're going to talk about psychosocial risk, talk about psychosocial issues. If you want to talk about procedural risks, which are real and we need to understand that, talk about it. But don't conflate that with a psychosocial claim.
I totally agree with most of what you said there. The bit where I think it's important to clarify as a connection into psychosocial risk management is the fact that particularly in that BlueScope Steel matter, what was stated was that they didn't want to subject witnesses through the process of investigation and giving evidence additional exposure to psychosocial risk. So that was the connection there for that one. But to your point around the actual ruling itself, so that was part of why we discussed that case, wasn't it? Was around this idea of how investigations are undertaken and how to not add additional psychosocial risk to humans, as particularly if they're needing to recount trauma or needing to describe psychologically distressing content.
Yep.
How to do that. But to your point, I think that ultimately is part of the process of how you do your investigation and complaint management and evidence, understanding facts of the matters.
Yes.
So that's I think I love the way you stated that we have a professional obligation to our constituents to be clear about what it is that these decisions are about and where the clarity is in terms of good practice and what it's telling us about good practice.
So if you take that BlueScope case again where they didn't call a witness, I think what would have made that a much more interesting case, and I'm not saying anybody should have done this, but if, for example, the employer had have tried to introduce the evidence in a different way to protect the complainant. So if they had have said, we're going to do it on affidavit, for example, and not call them, or if they said, we'll do it by remote video or something so they're not traumatized or other, and I don't know, again, Kate, this is more your area of expertise, but finding different ways to achieve the procedural outcome you need to achieve while minimizing the impact on the complainant. And I suspect we are going to have to start thinking about that, not just in the context of legal proceedings, but in the context of our internal processes. So we can't simply say that we owe this ultimate higher duty to a complainant and not then allow the alleged perpetrator to have some idea of the allegations they have to answer. So you've got to find the balance.
And that then does come back into the broader management of the organisational justice and the risks involved in the processes connected to organisational justice systems, policies and processes. So.
And it's again strikes me that it's just a bit of whether it's an overcorrection or an adjustment, I don't know, because we know that historically the social justice pendulum has swung too far the other way, where if somebody made a complaint about harassment or bullying, they weren't believed, or they were shuffled off to the side, or the power structures of the organisation often meant that complainants were marginalised. And so organisational justice has, to some extent, and I'm not saying this is universal, adjusted to say, you will be believed, or at least you'll be supported if you make these types of complaints. But in some areas, I think we're seeing that pendulum swing too far the other way, and trying to get the balance right is a bit tricky.
Which I think is a fantastic segue into what we're planning to do for Series 2 in terms of bringing some guests and some people who we would say are experts in particular areas of psychosocial risk. Because I think the key area that you're referencing there, Greg, is to do with sexual harassment and gender-based violence and issues attached to that in the workplace. I wouldn't proclaim myself to be an SME in that area, neither are you, but we know it is a key area of great complexity in terms of psychosocial risk management. So that's an example of where, as we move into Series 2, we've had some thoughts about how we can, tinker with it to keep it interesting and to keep growing our approach and keep extending the SME input where we can, so listeners can hear people who are genuine experts in their fields in some of these risk areas.
I'm always fascinated by that because, again, from a legal risk management perspective, the legal view tends to be kind of somewhat procedural and mechanistic.
Yep.
So, you can say, well, you have to give people an opportunity to be heard and you have to put allegations to people, and you can work through the dots, and you can say, you can give directions to people to attend interviews because that's a reasonable and lawful direction in most cases, and you can drop the mechanics into place so you follow the bouncing ball. But psychosocial risk, not exclusively, but slightly more than other areas like this, it is that the how you do it, so that the how you put allegations, the how you give people the opportunity to respond, that how you get the parties around the table is critically important because of the potential trauma to all parties involved. And that's a different skill set from a legal risk management skill set.
Which takes, I think, our conversation to a point that we were keen to provide some space for yourself and for me to reflect on, were there any particular conversations of Series 1 where we thought maybe we could have articulated something a little bit differently, or feel on listening back that maybe we could have been clearer with a position. And it's interesting for me, the key point where, and there was someone who reached out to me. I might go first on this one, Greg, and you can have a bit of a think if there's anything that you want to clarify. But the conversation that we had in regards to the paper around applying standard risk assessment processes into the psychosocial context.
That was my favourite episode, by the way.
Was it?
Yeah.
I think it got the most downloads, actually. I had a piece of feedback from someone who I've known in the sector for a long time, occupational physician. I won't name him because I don't think he gave me permission to say his name. He probably wouldn't mind. But he called me and he said, Kate, let's catch up for a coffee. I'd really like to check in with you a little bit about some of your statements in that. And he said to me, and when I listened back to it, I thought, maybe he's right. He thought that I was very anti the whole idea of psychosocial risk assessment.
Right.
And I really just wanted to clarify, in case other people thought that isn't my position. My position is that I'm anti people applying a physical health and safety process, procedure, bouncing ball over psychosocial risk assessment. And so I just wanted to clarify that point when I reflect on, was there anything in Series 1 that maybe I would change how I articulated my views or thoughts on. And I think it's interesting because when we discussed that paper, there wasn't a lot that I was seeing in the market that did make that point. People were at that time, when we recorded that episode, very much advocating that you assess the risk and you classify it in terms of its frequency and its harm, and there you go, it's done, and thinking that that was great work. And there is now more conversation about how that's not good work, how that shouldn't be what people do.
Mm.
So I think that that's an interesting point, just in terms of where the market or where it seems as though conversation is heading, is that people are acknowledging that you can't just follow the physical health and safety bouncing ball
Yeah.
in the context of psychosocial risk. And I think that's a positive thing.
My take on that is a little bit different. First of all, I'm not anti-risk assessment as an exercise in theory. I've just never seen it done well in practice. So in 35 years or whatever it is now defending clients, I've never picked up an organisation or risk assessment at any level and said, oh, this is going to help. They're always hugely problematic. But in the specific context of psychosocial risk, and taking your point that the following the bouncing ball type position and the fact that people might be rethinking that, the difficulty we have, of course, is that the way the psychosocial risk regulations are written, you have to go through that physical risk assessment process. So
Well, yeah.
that's the bit that and perhaps have to go through that, might be stating it a little bit high,
Yeah.
but it has,
You need to show you've assessed the risk.
it's been set up. Well, again, in some jurisdictions, you have to follow the hierarchy of controls, which just to me doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever in the context of psychosocial risk. And most of what I've seen in the context of psychosocial risk assessments are really nothing more than a recitation of the sort of codes of practice and what the risk factors are, and no real assessment about how that arises in workplaces.
And I think that was where my brain went on listening to you, because I think if I'm to add an additional comment about hopefully my position or my thoughts on psychosocial risk assessment in organisations being clearly understood, is that I don't believe an enterprise level psychosocial risk assessment means that an organisation has now assessed and managed the risk, because
Oh, absolutely.
it changes at an enterprise level, is quite different at a team level. And if you do it at a team level, it's quite different to what might be happening at an individual level. So the organic nature of psychosocial risk as they intersect and the complexity attached to that means that, to your point, how effective is the enterprise level risk assessment in genuinely assessing risk? But as this colleague of mine said to me, well, Kate, it's certainly better than not doing anything if it's getting people reflecting, thinking, increasing their literacy and understanding of how these factors intersect and combine. And you kind of can't argue with that. But I think the point that you make is, well, but does it actually make people safer?
Well,
And that's the bit that, yeah.
I'd go back a step, and this is the proving safety sort of observation. This idea that it's better than nothing if it achieves certain outcomes, okay? The problem is we never test if it achieves those outcomes. So if it's designed to make people more aware and thinking about it and whatever, okay, if we think that's a good idea and we think that's what the risk assessment process should be in part about, then let's do that. But it is just as likely as this thing progresses that the risk assessment will not be a thought-provoking conversation-starting exercise. It will be a tick and flick compliance box that we just work through. And because that's what's happened to physical risk assessments in relation to physical risk. People say, oh, it gets people thinking. No, it doesn't. In a lot of cases, it actually stops people thinking, because all they do is pull off the previous bloody risk assessment or the one that they've got from their former employer, and they just copy it over, say, yeah, we've got one, now we can get on with it. In Proving Safety, I talked a lot about assumption and organisational corruption, and we've got to test that. It's no good saying, oh, it might not do what everyone thinks it does, but it's got these benefits. Test it. Test if it's got those benefits, because it's just as likely that it's doing harm. Anyway, vent over.
Well, I think
And
that
again-
was. Sorry, go again, Mr. Smith. Go again.
No. And the bit I want to emphasize, and this is where I get a bit frustrated with the whole exercise, is none of those risks are exclusive to psychosocial risk. They exist in most of our management systems and thoughts and processes.
Mm.
Okay.
Well, that was the point of conversation that I wanted to clarify. Anything that you wanted to, on listening to series 1, that you wanted to restate, correct, take the edges off, add more edges in?
No. I only regret that we're sort of, and I know it's the nature of the podcast, we just have to kind of chunk it down by themes, because every time we talk, you can start weaving in different conversations and directions. And I think that's going to continue to evolve as we evolve our way of doing this.
Absolutely.
But I've had some good feedback. People seem to find the conversations beneficial. I'm really looking forward to this next series where we really start diving into some of the, particularly some of the emerged cases for me around bullying and harassment, because we're getting this increased body of case law that's saying a whole lot of behaviours where people are bringing bullying claims are not bullying and they are not harassment.
Yeah.
So, because one of the things we have talked about a lot is, and this will, I suspect, come up when we talk more about your work in leadership, is that a lot of leadership is kind of, at the moment, a bit frozen about what can we do, what can't we do. And I think as we start to get more of these emergent cases, putting a bit more of a fence around what is and is not acceptable behaviour, I think that's going to be fascinating to explore and dive into.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the other feedback which has been nice, and thank you for people who have sent us messages, is that, to your point, Greg, the conversation is making them think. It is also endorsing for them the complexity of what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, so that,
Yeah.
sometimes it feels better to be in the complexity with other people,
Yes.
and that you don't feel so isolated when you're in conversation and people are trying to distill it down to a silver bullet, and you're sitting there thinking, hang on a second, I'm not sure that that's really good practice, or I don't think that's going to work. So if we're helping practitioners out there to not feel as alone, to be walking alongside them, really acknowledging the level of complexity and doing this work really, really well, then I think that's good, which is why we want to keep doing it. So that's good.
And on that note, I just want to share another cranky moment, because I think this is important. People really need to be informed consumers of information about psychosocial risk, because there are some reasonably credible people putting out information that's just wrong and misleading. So there was something the other day that was quite professionally done. It looked really good. It's on LinkedIn, making assertions that a company had been prosecuted, convicted and fined over $1 million in relation to allegations of bullying and harassment. And it was just wrong. The company had been investigated for bullying and harassment. I think it was Safe Work New South Wales, but they were never charged, or they may have been charged, I don't know. I don't think they were. Certainly they were never prosecuted and they were never convicted. And what the parties had done was enter into an enforceable undertaking, which is a mechanism available under health and safety legislation, where you sign up to an agreement with the regulator and say, we're going to do all of these things. And it cost them over $1 million in the end. But the enforceable undertaking contained an overt statement that it was not an admission of guilt. There was no findings of guilt. There was no findings of unlawful conduct. And so this statement goes out there into the universe that says your risk of prosecution and conviction is now over $1 million. And there's just no credible basis for that. And I think, and I could be wrong, but I think the highest fine to date for anything remotely resembling psychosocial type prosecutions is around 300,000, maybe 330. I could be wrong on that. Certainly nothing in the realm of 1 or 1.2 million, as was being argued. So just, to your point about the complexity, and perhaps not even complexity, but the potential confusion out there, Kate, I do think people need to be extremely cautious, particularly when they read people who are not lawyers making observations on legal proceedings in psychosocial risk. And in particular, please exercise caution before hitting the repost button. Because if you're reposting stuff that is misleading or wrong, it just doesn't help anybody.
Well said. Well said.
Mm.
Well, shall we share with listeners what we're planning in terms of the deep dive areas. And as this episode is released, EML are going to also complement the episode release with an opportunity for people to respond to a survey in terms of where their most urgent interest lies, so that Greg and I can then begin to map out the sequence of the content that we record. And that's something that Greg and I are really looking forward to for series 2, is the fact that it's going to be a lot more responsive to exactly what's going on out there. And if people have got feedback to us, that we can address it the next episode as we record. So hopefully our vision is that it will feel much more like a live kind of interaction with listeners, which wasn't possible for our series 1 because we'd recorded all the episodes before they were released. So should we share what our plan is, Greg? Please also have a look at the survey that's going to be available, and feel free to give us a nudge in terms of which direction you would like for Greg and I to focus first.
And so just to clarify what we mean by deep dives, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is we're going to take a theme and dedicate 2 or 3 episodes to it, really pulling it apart, looking at the research, looking at the case law around that area. Have I got that right?
Yeah, as well as the idea of having interviews with people who
Yes.
have more SME experience in that particular component of psychosocial risk than we might.
Yes.
So yeah, one of the areas that we thought would be of interest is leadership wellbeing.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly a lot of talk about leaders and the role that they play in managing psychosocial risk. They're detailed as critical control and mitigation measures, but they can also be hazards themselves. So that is an interesting one that we are keen to have a conversation on. Why don't you talk to the bullying and harassment one, Greg, and some of the intersections with some of the other risks that you're mindful we think will add value?
I think I touched on it before, but I'm very keen to start looking a bit more deeply in future episodes at bullying and harassment. And this does link in a little bit, I think, to the leadership stuff as well, Kate. This idea that, not every instance of rude, aggressive, forthright behaviour in the workplace suddenly becomes bullying or harassment.
People can be having a bad day.
Yeah, people can be having a bad day. It's a tricky one, but you say, you're allowed to bring your whole self or your authentic self to the workplace. Yeah.
That's such maybe we should consider a whole episode on that. I have so many people talk to me about that when the leadership coaching.
Yeah, that's a two-way street, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
If you can't come into work and speak honestly about someone's performance because you might offend them, you're not entitled to bring your whole self to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it really does impact leaders a lot, that one.
Probably
in terms
more
of
than
masks.
anywhere else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
But also the reality of the role that leaders are there to play. So it is an interesting one to discuss.
Mm. And the other one that you've already touched on as well, Kate, sexual harassment, misconduct, whatever you call it. I'm writing a new book on psychosocial risk in the Australian context.
Are you?
Yeah, one of the chapters I've pulled out, I've just renamed it, but it's called On the Question of Sex.
Oh.
And that's not in a feminist type discussion, it's just so much of what drifts into the realm of psychosocial risk is built around ideas of discrimination, misconduct, harassment. It sits as an interesting bucket, this whole question of sex in the workplace.
Mm. Well, another kind of component to that will probably sit across the bullying, harassment, as well as the sexual harassment and positive duty kind of conversations will be reasonable management action.
Yeah.
As well as how to do good investigations. That was another thing, remember, that we said that we were keen to do a deep dive into. What are good investigations? What does that look like from, your lens versus what does that look like with a trauma-informed or human-centered, person-centered lens? So, and how do those two things intersect? And then the other one that we're really conscious is being talked about a bit, and Greg, I think you also said that there's some interesting cases coming through in regards to the right to disconnect piece as well, which ultimately from a psychosocial risk perspective is a systemic approach to managing workload demands and managing work demands. So they're the ideas that we've had, listeners, and, please use the poll function that's there to put forward your views on what you think is the most urgent area for us to focus on, so then we can start planning out guest interviews, planning out conversations, but also let us know of anything else that you think is really relevant. Greg and I are both very active on LinkedIn. Please reach out to us because we'd love to hear from you in terms of things that you're struggling with or that you think a conversation between a psychologist and a lawyer might surface some interesting content.
Yep.
So that's really a wrap for us, I think, for today, wasn't it, Greg? Was there anything else that you thought would be good for us to be sharing in our kickoff episode for Series 2?
No. Enjoyed that conversation, got a bit off my chest. Great to listen to your insights as always. And we'll be back soon in terms of substantive material. We'll be kicking off around the whole question of leadership, psychosocial risk and leadership. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really your area of expertise.
Oh, well. And
I'm
it's
looking forward to
also,
it.
just wanted to let everyone know we will be moving to a fortnightly rhythm. So you can expect to see things released fortnightly. And so that, I think, again, is a great way to see that we can interact, take some feedback, respond to any kind of comments and feedback that we've had since the previous recording and our next recording. So with that, we didn't talk about what drinks we were having today, Greg. That was very neglectful of me in terms of how we're set up these conversations.
Sauv Blanc weather over here at the moment. Okay, it's pretty warm and humid and uncomfortable.
Well, seeing as how where I am and we're heading into Grand Prix weekend as we look to record, maybe I should be thinking beer, a nice, crisp, bubbly beer. Well, thank you again, everyone, for listening, and we hope that you will join us on the adventure that's going to be Series 2. Have a great rest of your day, wherever you are listening.
See you, everyone.
That's a wrap for another episode of Judgmental. Thanks again to our sponsors, EML. EML's Mutual Benefits Program provides organisations with free services, tools and resources to manage their workplace risk. You can follow EML, myself and Greg on LinkedIn, and be sure to check the show notes for links to the papers referenced in each episode, as well as resources available to help you as you navigate the wonderfully complex and nuanced world of psychosocial risk. See you again next time at the bar.